The great refectorium of the Valori Dominion sang with glass and flame, a cathedral of light where chandeliers chimed on invisible currents and courtiers wore silver like second skin. The long dais at the head of the hall stood half a step above the rest, flanked by two empty chairs no one had ever dared to occupy. Cade Mercer didn't know any of that. Not the rules, not the whispers, not the etiquette etched into the marble. He was late, hungry, and carrying a roll of survey vellum banded with grease, plans for the heat spines that ran beneath the palace like veins. He angled his shoulder through a gap in the servants, mumbled a quick "excuse me" coming through, and slid into the empty chair beside the sovereign. A hush fell like snowfall. He unrolled a map across his lap and a plate edge, balancing a heel of baker's bread on the map's margin. He chewed, pencil tucked behind one ear, eyes flicking between numbered corridors and unlabeled shafts. "If Vent 2 feeds into Vent 6 here," he muttered, "then pressure at the lantern wells is... No, that can't be right." At her right hand sat her radiance of the Ember Crown, Rissa Ornell, vulpine and resplendent. Fox ears flicked through her burnished hair, their inner fur the color of dawn. A fan of orange tipped sleekly down the sides of her temples to a narrow jaw that was still unmistakably human, cheekbones soft, lips generous. A single tail, thick and lustrous, curled over the carved arm of her chair, its fur a blaze of sunset. Rissa did not look at her guard captain when he stiffened. She did not look at the courtiers who drew breath sharply like swimmers meeting cold water. She looked only at the man who had taken a seat that had gone unclaimed since the day her mother died. Rissa's golden eyes slipped from his hands calloused, to his sleeves blackened, to the casual, oblivious curve of his mouth as he mouthed numbers. "Do you know," she asked softly, "where you sit, stranger?" Cade made a note, then another, then reached for the heel of bread, and only then seemed to notice the silence. He glanced up, blinked once, at the crown, the eyes, the tail, and, God's help him, smiled. "Right? Is this seat for someone? I can stand? Draw straight on my knee." Her tail flicked once. The guard took a step. Rissa lifted 2 fingers. The guard froze. "No," she said, a curl of humor in the word. "It seems it is for you." A shiver of scandal rippled down the tables. Rissa eased her goblet away from her lips and set it down as if nothing at all were extraordinary. The emberstone studs in her crown caught firelight and threw it in dizzy constellations along the ceiling. She watched the human watch his maps. "What consumes you so," she asked conversationally, "that you forget to look up in a room of blades?" "Thermal lattices," Cade said through a bite. "Your palace sits on a volcanic shelf. Someone rerouted the bleed channels to feed the spectacle. These hanging fire chimes." He tipped his chin at the singing glass. "Pretty, I'll give you that. But pretty can forget how heat takes revenge." Across the hall, 3 old lords swallowed indignation. One fanned himself with a program card. Another looked ready to faint. Rissa's ears angled forward, a tiny cant that, to those who knew her, meant, "I am listening." Up close, the fox details were gentler than the gossip. Orange fur feathered the edges of her hairline, soft enough to catch the light like silk. The bridge of her nose remained human. Only the slight sharpening below the cheekbones hinted at a muzzle that never quite arrived. "Heat takes revenge," she echoed, amused. "Do you always threaten your patrons home with poetry?" "Not a threat," Cade said, wiping a smear of graphite on his sleeve. "Math." He realized then he was talking to the ruler of an empire, and that he was also eating her bread. A flush crept up his neck. He lowered the heel. "Sorry about that. Long day. Shouldn't have—" "Eat," Rissa said, sliding an untouched platter toward him with 2 fingers. Her claws were only hints at the tips of her nails. An exquisite suggestion more than a weapon. "We are not so poor that we hoard comfort from those who do our thinking." The hall breathed again, but shallowly. Cade speared roast root and a sliver of smoked riverfish. "Thanks." "What should I call you, thermal lattices?" she asked. "Cade Mercer. Surveyor, sometimes engineer, sometimes idiot." He glanced toward her crown and then down again. You? The guard captain actually choked. Rissa's smile flashed, bright as a falling star. Rissa, she said, for tonight, that will do. Cade flattened his vellum and drew a quick diagram. Parallel vents like ribs, a central shaft like a throat. He tapped 2 points with his pencil. Here and here. Your bleed channels intersect ornamental heat sinks. It's crisped, Cade said, with a helpless grin. I can fix it. Can you? She said it not as doubt, but as invitation. He nodded. You've got a basalt dome under the central hall. It wants to flex, a little, on high-pressure days. If we decouple your chime anchors from the load-bearing arcs, reroute thermal bleed to the colonnade vents, and add slotted release plates under the dais, you keep the music and lose the hazard. Keep the music, she murmured, almost to herself. Throughout the court, men and women who worshipped appearances watched their empress lean closer to a dirty-fingered human who didn't bow. Fox ears swiveled minutely, catching the scratch of his pencil. The orange fur along her jaw warmed in the lantern light. Show me, she said. Cade rotated the map toward her. He forgot to be frightened. He forgot he had no right to touch her plate as he slid aside a bowl to make room. He explained in the language of lines, solid, dashed, dotted. He talked, and she listened, and somewhere around the words, pressure shear, the rest of the hall dissolved into the low hush of their 2 voices. And your pay? She asked at last, the humor returning to the edges of her mouth. What does a rescuer of dais and dignity demand? Cade, foolish, honest, a meal before it all, and a decent chair. Her laugh came like warm wine. A decent chair, she repeated, glancing sidelong at the very seat he had just desecrated by sitting. How enterprising. That was when he noticed the way the banners bowed toward her, how the guards stood like parentheses around her shadow, how the light loved her crown. The slow dawning horrified him. You are... Rissa's eyes glittered. Yes, she said gently, I am. He nearly inhaled the river fish sideways. Stars save me. They might, she said softly, but you appear determined to do the saving first. Cade stumbled up from his chair.
Your radiance? Your everything. I didn't mean to...
Sit, Rissa said, and the word pooled into the marble like warm light. He sat. She rose, and the hall bent with her. Her tail swept the air. The chandelier sighed. Hear me, she said without raising her voice. Cade Mercer is to be given full access to the underworks of Ornal Palace, unrestricted and unchallenged. His notes are to be treated as writ until proven unwise, triple his stipend. And for the love of my mother's crown, feed him. A low rustle as scribes scrambled. A collective blanch from the Architects' Guild. Rissa lowered herself back to the seat no one took. The room trembled, or maybe that was Cade's hands. She turned to him with a small, private smile. Close, he could see the faint, fine guard hairs that shimmered at the edges of her fox ears, the way they pivoted almost imperceptibly to the sound of his breathing. Show me the rest, she said. Begin with the part where we do not crisp. Cade swallowed, found his pencil, found his voice. Right. So. The basalt dome. By week's end, the refectorium looked like a sanctum open for surgery. Scaffolds ribbed the walls. The underside of the chime forest glittered with lifted panels and marked anchor points. Cade worked until his shoulders burned and his knuckles wore new skin. He taught a cadre of palace smiths to cut slotted release plates with millimeter tolerances. He argued with a chorus of offended decorators who prayed to the god of symmetry. Rissa Orino watched. Sometimes from the edge of the scaffolding, arms folded in a pose most thought-cutting, though Cade discovered it meant concentration. Sometimes from the polished floor, tail curled primly around her ankles, eyes following every chalk mark. Sometimes from so close on the scaffold rung below that he could feel warmth rise from the orange fur where it feathered along her cheek. On the third evening, when the last of the chimes had been lifted and tested through a reduced pressure purge, Rissa called for ember wine. A luminous red poured from a decanter etched with foxfire swirls. She handed Cade a cup with both hands. Drink with me, she said. or else I will be the only one who tastes this, and we both know I did less work." Cade sniffed, winced, drank. It went through him like a small, forgiving fire. He laughed, chest loosening. "I've wired half your hall into sanity," he said. "Now if it collapses, at least it'll do so poetically." Risa's ears tipped forward at the word collapse. "You jest." "I do," he said. "Mostly." She laughed then, a sound that startled her own guard. Soft at first, then warmer, rounder. Cade glanced down before he remembered not to. "You have... crumbs." He gestured. "You may touch me," she said, amused. "On occasion." She leaned in, deliberately defiant of 1,000 years of etiquette, and Cade, very carefully, brushed away a sugared fleck with the back of his knuckle. The hall did not implode. Neither of them turned to salt. Somewhere behind, a courtier made a strangled sound like a kettle. Rissa lifted her cup. "To heat that knows its place." "To chairs that don't explode," Cade said, and clinked. They chose an hour when the kitchen slept and the city breathed slow. Pressure valves were opened one by one under Cade's eye, and the basalt dome took its first careful drink. Steam purred through the colonnade vents. The hanging chimes awoke one tone, then a chord, then a whole shimmering skein of sound that turned the hall into a river. Rissa stood with him on the dais. Her tail brushed his calf, unthinking. He did not move. The orange fur along her jawline took the emberlight and made it velvet. The fox ears did their small pivot, catching harmonics. "You have not merely saved a hall," she said. "You have given it back its voice." "It always had one," Cade said. "Now it won't scream." They stood too close and too long, and when they realized it, neither stepped away. The music folded around them, patient. When it finished, it left the sense of a promise lingering in the rafters. Rissa turned, the crown casting constellations across the plane of his face. "Walk with me," she said. "Not as empress and servant, as Rissa and Cade." He walked. Through a gallery where fox-shaped lanterns winked gold, along a balcony where the city opened below like a bowl of stars. She gestured to the low stone line at the edge, worn smooth by centuries of standing and thinking. "My mother leaned here the night she decided to unseal the river gates," she said. "Everyone told her the flood would drown us. She changed the sluices instead. The river learned to sing." "Good choices and good engineering," Cade said. "Rare duet." Her golden eyes slid to him. "You speak as if you have made hard choices." "Not hard," he said. "Messy. I left a contract with the Boreal Guild. They wanted a palace that sang only to guests with the right seals." His mouth twisted. "I like music that doesn't check invitations." Something like approval flickered under the fox's calm.
"So you crossed the strait and found me."
"Found a job," he said, but too softly to make it a wall. It would have been a clean story if all it needed was math and flame. But a corridor is not a canal, and power never runs without friction. On the 5th day of testing, one of Cade's release plates clogged with something that wasn't mineral and wasn't chance. A sliver of silk, rolled tight and bound with wax stamped by a guild signet. The pressure spike came hot and swift. Cade felt it in his teeth. "Shut 6. He barked to the apprentice at the vent wheel. "Now." The spike caught a chime anchor half loosed. The metal shrieked, stuttered, and gave. A chain tore free. The world tilted a fragment left. Rissa, who had stepped onto the scaffold to ask an absurd question about frogs in winter, slipped. Cade didn't think. He threw himself, catching her waist with one arm and the chain with his other hand. The chain bit. Skin opened. Blood slicked. Heat punched up through the scaffold as if the palace itself had decided to breathe fire. "Let go," Rissa said evenly, fingers gripping his shoulder. Her tail lashed once, involuntary. The orange fur along her jawline bristled. "That arm is useless to me if it is off your body." "Not? Letting?" Cade grunted and wedged his shoulder under the weight. He kicked the brace pin into the slot with his heel. Somewhere below, the apprentice found a second courage and wrenched 6 closed. The spike hissed away. The chain settled. The hall exhaled. Rissa's ears flattened and rose. She made herself still with visible effort. "You are bleeding." "Yeah," he said, and suddenly the pain arrived like a courier late to the party. Hadn't noticed. They climbed down slow. The guard captain met them with 3 men and a cursing physician. Rissa did not release Katie's sleeve until the salve hissed in the wound. She did not release it then, either. "Someone wants my hall to fail," she said. "Someone wants you to fail," Kate answered. "The hall is just a big, glittering way to get there." Rissa's eyes, those steady, vulpine golds, narrowed to a hunter's gleam. Her tail smoothed. "Find them with me?" she said. "Thought you'd never ask." Tracking sabotage is less dramatic than the ballads insist. A string of ledgers, a door guard with a dice habit, a seamstress who sees too much. Katie and Rissa followed the thread from the Silk Guild to the accountants of the architect's chapter, where numbers go to hide and drown. They sat on the floor of a wreck. "You are very good at sums," she said. "This would bore most rulers to tears." "It does," Cade said. "I just like the part where the sums tell on liars." He pointed. "A triple requisition for anchor oil, billed to 3 different projects with identical handwriting. And again, here. The same loop for lacquer. That is your saboteur. He bought twice, pocketed once, and paid another to clog a plate." Rissa eased back against the wall, ears tipped in satisfaction. "Zeman Cal, architect. Very fond of symmetry, less fond of law." "You going to have him dragged through the square?" Cade asked lightly. "I will have him questioned," Rissa said. "Then fined until he forgets the shape of his own coin. And I will have him stand under the chimes while you explain to him what mistakes do to people." She paused. "If he looks pale, perhaps I will even laugh." Cade looked over. "You laugh when you're kind of dangerous." She considered that, then smiled. "A clean, unarmored thing. I laugh when I am alive." He looked away before he could make the room smaller by saying the wrong thing. "You want chairs?" "Not yet," she said. "The floor feels like the part of the world that cannot lie." After confessions and fines, the hall returned to its work. The chimes learned their new balance. The release plates breathed in time with the city. People smiled in the corridors again, like a draft had stopped. The festivals approached, the ember and rain pairing that marked the Valori year's turn. In the ember procession, dancers carried fox-tailed pennons along the palace colonnades. In rain, fountains sang. Rissa asked Cade, as if it were nothing, to walk beside her. He came scrubbed and bewildered in a plain black coat that looked somehow tailored to him even though he'd bought it off a peg. Rissa wore no crown, only a circlet the color of her eyes and a spray of orange feathers that echoed the fur at her jaw. Without the full regalia, she looked younger, less invincible, more herself. "You clean up," she observed as they fell into step. "You do everything," he said, because it was true, and what else could he say? The city roared when she appeared. Fox-eared children pressed oranges into her hands. Old men bowed with the stiffness of oaks. Cade watched her watch them, and something loosened in his chest. Not worship, not awe, but recognition. He knew the shape of the job beneath the jewels. Long hours. 1,000 interruptions. 30 different people who think they own your time. The math of care. They reached the river stair in rainlight. Rissa stopped where the carved fox head spit water into the basin. "Do you remember?" she asked softly. "Your first meal here. The bread?" Cade groaned. "Can we burn the memory?" "Please." "We will keep it," she said, tail swaying. "As a charm against vanity." A small boy darted forward with a paper boat, cheeks flushed. He thrust it at Cade instead of Rissa, shy, eyes huge, at the sight of the human who walked with the Empress. Cade crouched. He folded the nose tighter, set the boat in the fountain, and blew. It caught the current, spun once, and sailed cleanly through the foxmouth into the river beyond. The boy whooped. Rissa's laugh. There, again, rippled the surface of the day. She touched Cade's shoulder. Stay tonight, she said, so quietly that only the rain and the river heard, not to speak of sums. To be still. He nodded, throat dry. I wasn't planning on leaving. Rissa's private quarter was gilt, yes, and velvet, yes, but there were also scuffed places on the floor where someone had paced hard through long nights. The shelves held an atlas worn to the bone, a copper clock that ticked irregularly, a bowl of loose buttons. This was not the room of a statue. It was a room that worked. She poured ember wine again, but diluted with river water, a common trick on ember and rain. They sat on the low couch, not touching. The tail lay between them like a warm scepter. Kade kept his hands to himself because he wanted to keep them, which meant he could not trust them. Tell me about before, she said. Not the guild. You. He told her about a sister who could weld as if God had made flame for her hands, about a mother who loved the storms, about the sound of foghorns under a bridge so old the iron had learned to sing. She told him about a grandfather who had run a tea stall in the shadow market and had given away more cups than he sold, about a teacher with black nail polish who taught her to draw the empire to scale. They laughed at first, and then they did not. The quiet grew around them until it had weight. You are the only person who has sat at my side, and he didn't know whether she meant bread or this. He leaned forward carefully, because he knew metals well enough to know what happens when you touch them too fast. He stopped with his forehead almost to hers, so he could feel the heat of her skin. Rissa, he said, a name and a question. She closed the spare breath. Her lips tasted faintly of river and flame. The tail twitched, then stilled. Somewhere a clock remembered to tick. When they parted, it was because they were smiling too much to keep kissing. Stay, she whispered, which he had already promised, but he said it aloud anyway, because some promises deserve sound. I'm not going anywhere. Some mornings insist on beginning in laughter. Cade woke to a tray of currant bread and citrus slices and something that might have been an omelet built by a cathedral. He remembered that he had kissed the Empress and, worse, that he wanted to do it again. Star, save me, he told the ceiling. I'm in trouble. A knock. A servant bowed too low and tried not to look at Cade's bare feet. From Her Radiance, the servant said, and fled. Cade sat cross-legged on the floor to eat. He looked like the man who had arrived days ago, scruffy, a little lost, in clothes that didn't care about thrones. But he did not feel like him. Something had rewired. He didn't see Rissa until afternoon. She was in the training yard, of all places, with a wooden staff and a circle of instructors. She moved like war had been taught to dance. Low, elastic steps that turned pivots into poetry. Her fox ears collapsed and rose with the rhythm. Her tail kept a counterbalance, instinctive and exact. When she saw Cade, she smiled in a way that almost tripped her. The guard captain pretended not to notice. Eat? She asked after, toweling sweat from her hairline, the orange fur along her jaw beaded with dew. Already did, Cade said, and then, because the ground had shifted under both of them, because they needed to say this out loud, I'll keep working on the hall, but if you want me gone, I want you here, Rissa said, so flat and sure that it left no room for argument, until the hall sings and after. He looked foolishly relieved. All right then. Palaces are machines that use rumor as fuel. A human sat beside the Empress. The Empress laughed. The Empress smiled at currant bread. The Empress let her tail brush his leg as if there were no word for distance. Some hated it. They always do. Some adored it. They always will. But the thing that mattered was not love or hate. It was the way the servants began to hum again, and the way the chimes learned to scale their own season without fear of cracking. Rissa and Cade discovered a schedule. Days of sums and scaffolds, evenings that sometimes belonged to work, sometimes very deliberately did not. They learned the small joys of domestic rebellion, how to smuggle paper cups of street ginger tea past 3 lines of courtiers, how to sit cross-legged on the dais when no one else dared walk on it, how to loosen a crown from hair without snagging a single guard hair at the ear. They learned the larger ones, too. When an old general raised a public question about the propriety of personal choice, Rissa thanked him for his concern and detailed the 3 times he had used palace contracts to enrich his third nephew. The general retired to the countryside 2 days later, where he became a famous grower of pears. Cade sent him a book on soil. On the first night, the repaired hall was opened to the city, the chimes lit with foxfire glass and corner lanterns. Rissa stood with her people. Cade stood at her side. They had built something that did not break. They had decided where the heat would go and where it would not. They had given a voice back to a room that needed one. As the chords rose and the marble hummed underfoot, Rissa leaned very slightly into Cade's shoulder. He did not look down. He didn't need to. The tail's tip tapped his ankle 3 light beats, her new code for I am here. He tapped back. I know. Not every story that begins with a forbidden seed ends with a coronation kiss and a festival. The world is longer than that. Rissa had enemies who remembered too much and friends who remembered too little. There were border fires to the north and a trade schism to ease with the Glassblower's Isles. Cade was drafted, gently but inexorably, into the long arithmetic of empire. He did not become a lord. He did not want to. He became instead the keeper of the palace's breath. He tuned the water stairs so that the flood sang and never roared. He built a quiet room beneath the refectory where Rissa could be not radiance for exactly 30 minutes without any. On one late night when the lamps went thin, when decisions had layered on decisions until the table groaned, Cade reached and took Rissa's hand without looking. She squeezed back. You once said, she murmured, that heat takes revenge. It does, he said, unless someone loves it enough to teach it better. She turned, fox ears tilting, eyes bright with tired pride. Stay, she said, the same word from the first night, now hoarse with history. I will, he said, which they both knew meant, I am, already. They built one more thing together that no one saw. Not a hall, not a street, not a policy. A bridge, narrow and low, between 2 roofs that should not have met. It existed for exactly 2 people, and a single small fox that had learned to follow them, and to sit like a curled exclamation point on the warm stones. Here no guard stood. Here the orange fur along Rissa's jaw glowed peach in the first threads of dawn, her ears unornamented, the line of her face unstudied. Here Cade allowed a quiet to bloom in him that had never taken root since he was a boy. Do you ever wonder, he asked, what would have happened if I had looked up in the hall and backed away? I would have eaten alone, she said, and my hall would have waited to burn. And you? He asked. She considered. The tail curled. I would have learned to laugh later, she said. Or never. He reached up and tucked a strand of her hair behind a fox ear, careful of the guard hairs, careful of everything. I'm glad you didn't have to wait. So am I, she said, and kissed him to prove it. Years later, travelers stood in the great refectorium and asked docents why an ordinary wooden chair sat beside the ember throne, plain as a fishing stool, polished only by use. It belonged to the keeper, the docent said. Not a lord, not a prince, a human who fixed the palace and forgot to bow. And the empress? Travelers asked. She sat there, the docent said, smiling, and laughed. Sometimes she ate his bread. On certain winter evenings, when the heat rose clean and the chimes told time the way hearts do, those who looked up into the forest of glass swore they heard something else between the notes, a low murmur like figures in chalk, a woman's laugh, braided with it, the tiniest brush of a foxtail against a boot. Heat unlearned revenge in Ornal Palace. It learned something harder. It learned to stay. And so did they. The Vare arrived beneath thundercloud banners, wolf-kin with ash-gray ears and eyes like riverstone. Their chief envoy, Mara Vare, wore no jewels, only a thin torque of hammered iron and a cloak that still smelled of rain. Rissa met her in the Gallery of Compacts, where every treaty was carved small into the marble ribs like prayers only stone could read. Ember Queen, Mara said, inclining her head the precise degree that did not count as bowing. Her own tail, shorter than a fox's, brushier, flicked once. Your heat runs hot at our border dams. Your dams are old, Rissa said, calm, golden gaze steady. Old things leak. We propose to help. We propose to not be helped, Mara said, a smile that bared opinions and canines. Cade stood half a step back, ink on his fingers, the ghost of a wrench in his palm even in silk sleeves. You have cavitation scars on 3 spill gates, he said without preface. Seen it from the inspection ledges? Bubbles chewing metal like mice. If a spring flood hits while your sluices chatter, the shock will travel. You'll be hauling gate fragments like coffins. Mara's ears canted. She didn't look at Rissa. She looked at Cade, measuring the human as if weighing meat in mathematics. You are the one who taught heat to behave. He taught it manners? It still has teeth, Rissa said lightly. We will survey together, Mara decided, a test disguised as concession. No chains, no crown attendants. A neutral crew. Rissa's tail curled, amused. Done. The only chain will be the one that keeps Cade from climbing where the rock heaves. No chain forged can do that, the guard captain muttered. He wasn't wrong. The border dam rose like a scar across the gorge, old stone pinned with modern iron, spray writing its own scripture in the air. Cade walked the catwalk, boots clanging a tune he could read with his ankles. He crouched to run a finger across a spillgate edge. The metal hummed back through his bones, pitted, tired, proud. Mara watched, hood thrown back to the rain. We built this when the Veer still wore bronze, she said. Your mother's mother signed the water treaty with my grandmother on that pier. She nodded to a cleft of rock where moss had swallowed an old oath stone. Old things do not like new hands. Old things like living, Cade said, and gates like smoother flow. He chalked marks on the steel where you talk like a river, Mara said, more impressed than irritated. Grew up under a bridge that moaned when the tide turned, Cade said. You learn to listen or the city eats you. They ran a controlled release, first with the old gates, then with Cade's temporary baffles bolted in place. The second song was lower, steadier. The catwalk stopped shivering in its joints. Mara's smile reached her eyes. I will not say thank you, she said, which in Vare meant exactly that. But I will drink with you. Ember wine? Cade offered. Wolfberry, she countered. They drank both. Rissa's ears were forward and pleased, her tail a slow river curl. The rain thinned to a finer veil, as if the sky accepted the new arrangement. Peace never holds still. While they tuned the dam, letters reached Orinal. Shipments of foxfire glass for the refectorium's outer lanterns arrived cloudy, brittle as old frost. A palace apprentice sliced a palm on a rim that should have been wither-smooth. Rissa summoned the guild of glassblowers, masters in cobalt aprons, hands that glowed from years of fire. Master Inea brought samples and too many smiles. Cade knocked a knuckle against a lantern throat and heard a dead thud where a bell should sing. Lime too high, he said, and sand with too much salt. It will cloud and craze, then fail under thermal cycle. Master Inea frowned delicately. Our recipes have not failed in 5 generations. Your merchant has, Rissa said, tapping a ledger. You bought from the outer flats to save coin. The flats have brine under the sand. I know my coast. Inea's canines flashed. Fox-like, though she was human, pride smarting. We will remake at cost. You will remake at your cost, Rissa corrected, velvet over iron. And you will deliver your master mix to our lab for verification. Trade secrets. Inea began. Rissa's tail stilled. Safety does not negotiate. Cade gently set the flawed glass down and leaned in, voice low. Master, if the lantern's craze, shards will fall from 50 cubits. Let me keep your craft's honor intact. I'll tune the kiln curves with you, not over you. He sketched a firing schedule, a cooling ramp that kissed the annealing range like a lover who knows when to stop, Inea's breath eased. "You speak our tongue for a man of numbers," she murmured. "I speak doesn't break," he said. By week's end, Foxfire burned pure again. Cade lifted one perfect lantern to his ear for the joy of the ring. Rissa watched him watch it, the way he always held good work like a small animal. Careful, delighted, a little in awe. News ran faster than trade. The Ornell Palace had a human with ink under his nails and the Empress's laugh in his pocket. A courier skiff brought 2 passengers at dawn. A woman with weld burns mapped like constellations down her forearms, and a wiry boy with a backpack that rattled with tools. "Kira Mercer," the woman announced at the gate, squinting at guards as if they were new alloys. "And Joss. We're here to see if Cade has remembered to eat anything that isn't bread." Cade met them with both arms and a shock of shy joy that made Rissa's chest ache in a place not used to that kind of ache. Kira looked the Empress up and down with a gaze that did not know the word majestic, only capable and kind. Joss stared at Rissa's ears with scientific rapture and tried not to ask all 12 questions at once. "Do they move on their own?" he blurted. "Can you hear better than humans? Is the tail heavy? Does the fur—" "Joss," Kira warned. Rissa crouched to the boy's height, tail curling once like a comma. "Yes, yes. Only when wet. And soft, if you stroke along the fur, not against." She held out the very tip. Joss stroked once, reverent, and promptly turned scarlet. Rissa laughed and absolved him with a wink the color of sunrise. That evening in the little stovetop room, Kira flipped an omelet with the authority of a general. "So," she said to Cade over the sizzle, "you broke a palace and then fixed it. Sounds like you." "Broke bad habits," Cade said. Kira's gaze tipped to Rissa. "And you let him?" "I asked him," Rissa said. It felt like asking a tide, miracle and choice at once. Kira's shoulders eased. "Then we're friends." They were. Joss slept that night in a guest bed with fox-carved posts and wrote in pencil on his palm, "Ask about basalt domes." Trouble has a way of picking still afternoons. Rissa, Cade, Kira, and Joss walked the palace orchards, where citrus burned against green like small suns. Joss raced ahead, delighted by a gravity-fed irrigation channel that sang. A shout snapped the air. Smoke knifed up from the colonnade roof. Black, wrong. Cade's legs moved before thought. Rissa's tail slashed. Kira was already ripping a wool runner from the wall. "Joss, sand!" She shoved the boy toward a bin. He came back, staggering with a bucket and righteousness. Rissa dropped to the attendants, pulled them clear, lungs working in shallow, planned breaths. Her crown wasn't on. Her authority still was. "Door," she ordered. The guard slammed it, and Kira pressed the wool to the threshold while Cade and Joss fed sand through the sill gap with fast, practiced hands. The fire beat once, twice, under the rug, then guttered to a dull animal growl. Cade felt the temperature shift through the stones, down, down, like a fever breaking. He braced the door with his shoulder until the hinges sighed. When they opened, the storeroom was a black lung. A broken lantern lay inside with a wick that did not match palace stock. Rissa's ears tipped forward, dangerous as a drawn bow. "Sabotage again," she said. Kira wiped ash on her trousers. "Someone's scared of what you two are building." "Then they should be," Kira added, feral pride in her voice. And Rissa liked her more in that instant than she had liked any ally in a year. The soot said more than flame. Joss perched on a stool in the lab while Katie and Rissa laid shards in neat rows. He turned a wick fragment under a glass. Rissa's whisker-fine guard hairs along her cheeks caught the lamplight as she leaned in. "Not foxfire oil," Cade said. "This carries resin and a trace of bittering agent." Rissa's eyes narrowed. "Bitterleaf from the outer docks." Joss bounced. "There's a dock stamp. See, the letters UT on the cap. That's Umber and Tynes. Merchant house that feeds the glassblower's west kiln. Which Master Inea swore she doesn't use," Rissa finished, ears forward. They paid Umber and Tynes a midnight call. The ledger boy folded fast, the factor folded faster. The oil came on a side account signed by Z-Man Cal, the same architect who had clogged a release plate with silk and wax. He'd used a nephew's name this time. Old tricks rarely learn new faces. Rissa did not roar. She never needed to. Summon Zeman, she told the captain, and if he runs, I will assume he prefers to finish his career fixing gutters in the outer ring. He ran. Of course he ran. Cade smiled without humor and produced a map of the service tunnels that linked the palace to the city like roots. He'll take the violet conduit to the salt works, he said. It's the only exit where you can leave in a glycerin cart without being seen. Show me, Rissa said. They went with a half-squad and Kira, who ignored rules about who was allowed to come because fire had set its teeth in her day. The violet conduit breathed brine and old iron. Zaman's footsteps skittered ahead like mice. Guilt smells like salt too, if you know how to breathe it. They caught him at the sluice ladder, panting, face a chalkboard of bad arithmetic. Rissa stood between him and the night. Why? She asked softly. He spat words, status, custom, the greatness of design unmarred by grubby hands. She listened the way stone does, patient, non-negotiable. Then she turned to the captain. Charge him, she said. Not with insult. With endangerment. Let the chimes be set aside for his hearing. I will read him the pressure numbers myself. Zaman broke then, not at the law, but at the idea of an empress reciting mathematics to weigh his sins. The city learned. These things always become a story. The empress who taught a saboteur what a force diagram feels like. The human who smothered flame with sand while laughing the city adds laughter. Cade had coughed. The wolf-kin envoy who drank ember wine on a dam that stopped its chatter. Stories have offspring. A petition rolled in from the western counties, signed by farmers in clean script. If the throne can be tuned like a gate, can the taxes? Another from the keel writes, if heat can be taught mercy, can policy? A third, from the Shadow Market tea stall that had once belonged to Rissa's grandfather, simply said, when? Rissa read them at the Bridge of Quiet with Cade and the small fox asleep on her tail like a brooch. If I move too fast, I shatter them, she said. If I move too slow, they cool and die. Metals have curves, Cade said. Load too fast and they yield, load too slow and they creep. You choose a rate and hold your nerve. She looked at him sidelong, smile bare and tender. Hold it with me. Always. She sent for the Council of 30. She set out a program that would shift tax load from fixed land rates to throughput. Opposition coalesced around a single, handsome lie, that a fox-crowned empress had fallen under a human spell and was letting the palace be run by the man she kissed. Rissa did not answer the lie directly. She brought the council into the refectorium at noon when the sun hammered down and she had Cade explain the release plates. Halfway through, she interrupted him, not to correct, but to finish his sentence. Her math was clean, her voice cleaner. The lie died of embarrassment. Spring came early, kicked by a warm ocean tongue that licked snow from the highlands in 3 days. River gorges frothed. The border dam they'd tuned woke to a roar that wanted to write its name on every town downstream. Maraveir met them on the catwalk among voices that had to be shouted to be born. The old sluice won't clear fast enough, she said without apology or excuse. We'll drown the low farms. Cade pointed where water silvered in sheets that should have been strings. Your apron wall's too short for this head. We'll use the spill steps as a weir. You will not, said the dam master, scandalized. Those steps were for ceremony. Ceremony is what you do after the river leaves you alive. Cade snapped, and Rissa's tail flicked, approval hidden in the motion. We'll pin boards along the step lips, make a temporary labyrinth weir. The water will waste energy in turn pools. It won't hit your apron like fists. It'll kiss it like 1,000 little hands. You have 4 hours, Mara said, already unrolling rope from her shoulder. They built a miracle out of timber and nerve. Cade sketched, Mara bellowed. Rissa tied knots with hands that could sign decrees while blindfolded. The river rose to the weir, snarled, and obeyed. It roared, yes, but with rounder teeth. The village below watched its fields fill to the line and no farther. At dusk, exhausted, soaked, alive, they sat on the catwalk and told the sky that it was a fine shade of almost purple. Mara handed Cade a wolf berry flask, Rissa an iron coin she wore on a cord. "We give these to those who keep us," she said. "Do not lose it," the Veil remembered debts. Rissa turned the coin in her palm. "We will remember yours." The dam hummed under them, less a beast than a sleeping dog. Cade leaned back against a sun-warmed girder and let himself imagine, briefly, what the Dominion would sound like when all its engines sang in tune. With floods survived and saboteurs unmasked, the Dominion discovered a strange sensation, momentum. But momentum can fling a body off a curve if you do not lean. An elder counselor knocked on Rissa's door at an hour that did not belong to politics. He was small and careful and had taught Rissa the names of birds when she was 8. "You are carrying 2 jobs," he said, "ruler and builder. The second is eating the first. You must choose." "Choose," she repeated, soft. Her ears did not move. "Delegate the building," he said, "or consider a protectorate. Let the Dominion test a season under a steward who does not wear the crown. You will break more quickly if you keep both weights." After he left, Rissa climbed to the bridge of quiet and did not speak until the stars were bored with listening. "He is not wrong," she said at last. "I am 2 people." Cade, who had spent a lifetime being 3, sun maker, stubborn, studied the city where his maps had turned to streets. "What would you be," he asked, "if you could set one down without losing yourself?" "Rissa," she said. "And if you set the other down?" "Empress. Which one feeds you?" She looked at his hands and the way they made shapes in the air when he was thinking circles for flows, squares for rooms, a crooked line for luck. "The first." He said nothing for a while. Then we need a steward. Not forever. Long enough for the hall you call Dominion to learn to sing without you tuning every note. Silence turned heavy and then light. Her tail reached his boot. 3 taps. "I am here." He tapped back. "I know." The steward selection cracked old loyalties like thin ice. Names rose. "Mara Vare. 2 foreign," some said. "Precisely because foreign," said others. "Master Inia. Brilliant. But the guild would own her." The small elder who loved birds. Wise, but tired. Rissa chose someone few expected. Soren Pell Day, the river engineer, who had turned 3 villages from flood maps into orchards in 10 years, and never once spoken above a pleasant murmur. Soren arrived with mud on his boots and 4 notebooks. He bowed to Rissa, nodded to Cade, and asked a servant for tea. "If the Dominion is a machine," he said after 1 sip, "we will oil it gently and tighten nothing in anger." "You will be cursed," Rissa warned. "By those who prefer rust?" "I have been cursed by worse," he replied, cheerfully. She announced afterward on the bridge. Rissa exhaled the way a gate does when surge drops. "Empress is a coat," she said quietly. "I will wear it again. But tonight I will not." Cade leaned his shoulder lightly to hers. "Tonight you are the woman who eats her own food and steals mine." "Share," she corrected, smiling. "Always," he said. The year of the protectorate became a year of between things. Rissa visited schools that smelled of chalk and oranges, walked markets without a retinue beyond 1 guard who knew when to vanish, learned the names of 3 more neighborhood cats and 1 particularly self-important goose. Cade rode the tram lines he had rebalanced so they sang on curves. He taught apprentices to read stress with their fingers and joy with their ears. Kira took on a palace contract to rebuild the east boiler with an eye for safety over spectacle. Joss apprenticed himself to Master Enea for a month, burned his thumb, and claimed, delighted, that he'd joined a priesthood. Soren Pell tuned taxes like notes. He changed nothing catastrophically and enough essentially that people noticed their carts clattered less on neglected stones. He sent Rissa a note every week. One thing solved, one thing stubborn, one thing he did not understand. She answered in the margins, not as Empress, but as the woman who knew where the palace hid its moods. Sometimes Rissa and Cade did nothing together at all. They brewed tea. They counted foxes at dusk. They argued, gently, earnestly, about whether the new weir in South Fork should be curved Cade or jagged Rissa. The fish ladders liked the turbulence. They forgot they were famous and went to buy ginger buns like anyone else and paid with exact change. The Dominion discovered that it could run without fear, not without friction, never that, but with a chosen hum. A year runs out as surely as a candle. Soren Pell returned the seal at dusk to the refectorium, where the chimes held their breath, then sang. He bowed and said, "It is tuned, not perfect. Perfection is for graves." Rissa stood with the coat she had named Empress, folded on her arm. She looked at Cade. He did not nod or speak. He simply widened that stubborn margin he kept around truth so she could fit inside it. Rissa put the coat on. It did not bite. It warmed. Her fox ears rose. The orange fur along her jaw took the light like a promise. "People of the Valori Dominion," she said, "we will keep the changes that breathe, and set aside the ones that pinch. We will remember that heat takes revenge but can be taught a gentler song. We will build rooms where rulers take off their crowns and eat with their hands." The hall laughed, the kind of laugh that means we are not afraid to be spoken to as if we were human. And for those who ask if a human turned our palace into a workshop, she added, eyes bright, I answer, yes. And thank every star for it. She sat. Beside her, the ordinary chair, polished by use. Cade's hand brushed the underside where, months ago, he had carved a small hidden signature, a maker's mark he had never used on a palace before. She knew where it was. She had traced it with her fingertip at midnight, smiling. They looked at each other, and at the city that had learned to sing without forgetting how to listen. The chimes rose. The release plates breathed. The river kept its course with mildness and muscle. The fox on the bridge of quiet dreamed of ginger buns and work gloves. Heat stayed where it should. And so did they. Years later still, apprentices brought their first calipers to the refectorium and did the pilgrim's knock on a lantern throat to hear if their hearts were tuned right. Guides told new lovers the story of the day a human sat where no one dared, and an empress laughed like someone who had found breakfast after a fast. If you come at noon, you can hear the pause, the single heartbeat where the chimes hold their breath. That's where old fear used to live. Then the notes roll, and the room remembers the math of mercy. On some evenings, if the sky is right and the river is telling its favorite joke, you might see them slip to the roof bridge, a maker with ink on his hands, and a fox-crowned woman who knows the names of geese. They rarely speak. They don't have to. The seat was once a warning. Then it was a scandal. Then a promise. Now it is simply what it looks like, a place for two people to sit side by side and eat their own food. Heat, having learned, does not forget. Neither do they. They called it the Festival of Maps, though it was really a festival of permission. For one day each year the underworks opened, Mara Vare returned with a small caravan and a bigger grin. Her niece, a quick-eyed girl named Wren, stood beneath the chimes and closed her eyes to hear the math. She would stay in Orinel for a season to learn kiln curves from Master Inea and river curves from Cade, and to teach street games to Joss that the boy would pretend not to lose. Midday brought the single heartbeat of silence before the chime's noon song. Rissa stood with her people and did not speak. She didn't need to. The pause said what 100 decrees could not. We remember what this room used to fear and what it learned to love. When the sound rolled out, vast, tuned, merciful, she reached for Cade's hand without looking. He was there, warm and ink-stained, the way a place is there when you stop running from it. They dedicated a small plaque no bigger than a palm, set discreetly in the dais stone where only those who knelt to look would find it. Heat can be taught. Voices can be returned. Sit, eat, repair. Kira wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist and swore at the dust. Soren laughed and said it was the finest policy statement he'd ever read. Inea traced the letters and muttered something about annealing hearts. Even the guard captain, who had once counted breaths between risks, admitted the room felt lighter when people understood the pipes that loved them. At dusk, lanterns of true foxfire woke along the colonnades, their glass flawless, their throats singing when you tapped them with a fingernail. Rissa walked the circuit with the easy stride of someone who knew both the shortest routes and the good detours. She paused at the bridge of quiet to watch the city take its evening breath. You once said perfection is for graves, she told Soren when he ambled up with tea. I stand by it, Soren replied. But harmony is for the living. You have that. Cade leaned on the parapet beside her, shoulder brushing hers. Below, the tramlines hummed the new low note he'd taught them. The floodgates downstream exhaled on time, and the old fox at the Shadow Market tea stall rang her bell twice for luck. Ready? He asked softly. For? To not make a speech, she smiled. My favorite duty. They didn't. Instead, they ate buns. That, too, became tradition. A year later, then 3, then 5, the seat beside the ember throne never stood empty. Sometimes Cade filled it. Sometimes Kara, when a boiler case demanded a voice that could lift steel with a sentence. Sometimes Mara, when the Vare brought river news. Sometimes Wren, grown quick and brilliant, when glass sang new colors. Often it was just Rissa alone with a plate, because the lesson had stuck. We do not starve ourselves in public to feed fear. On an evening striped with rain, Rissa and Cade returned to the Bridge of Quiet with a small fox trotting like punctuation at their heels. The city's windows wrote warm poems in the wet dark. They stood without words for a long time, as they did on the best days. Do you ever miss the beginning? Cade asked at last, half a smile in it. When I mistook a throne for a spare chair and stole your bread. Shared, she corrected, tails tip tapping his boot. 3 beats, still their code, and no, I do not miss eating alone. He turned the iron coin Mara had given him over in his palm, thumb whirring the worn wolf head smooth. There will be other floods, other fires. Yes, she said, and other festivals, other maps. The fox scrambled up the parapet to sit between them, wet fur smelling of river and spice. Down in the refectorium, the last tours drifted beneath the chimes. Someone, bold or in love, or both, tapped a lantern throat. The pure note leapt the courtyard, reached their bones, and settled there the way a good truth does. Rissa slipped the crown off and set it on the parapet stone. No fanfare, no fear. The orange fur along her jaw took the rain and made it glow. Her ears pivoted to the city's chorus. Tramlines, laughter, cutlery, the distant thrum of gates working as designed. She looked at Cade the way builders look at a finished span at sunset. Not as an end, but as a proof that ends are simply strong beginnings. I cannot promise a quiet reign, she said. Quiet's for libraries, he said. We're an engine. She laughed, the low, velvet sound that once startled courts and now tuned them. Then we will keep oil at hand. He held up a paper bag he'd been hiding. And ginger buns. Essential statecraft, she agreed gravely. They ate in the rain because they could. No courtier scurried them inside. No rumor could make them smaller than their work. The fox nosed a crumb, then curled on Rissa's tail and closed its eyes to the weather. Below, the refectorium held its breath for that single heartbeat and sang. The song threaded steam tunnels and street gutters. The note climbed the parapet, too, and rested in the hollow between 2 people who had learned the same lesson from different directions. Heat can be taught. Power can listen. Love is a room you keep repairing. Rissa set the crown back on, not as burden, but as tool. Cade slid the coin back in his pocket. Debt remembered. Debt loved. They turned toward the stairs, toward the days, toward whatever the Dominion would ask next. The city, tuned, answered with a hush full of promise. And both of them, fox-crowned Empress and ink-fingered Maker, smiled like people who intended to keep showing up. The seat keeps choosing.